Well, continuing our conversation now with Zolani Mkiva, who is the General Secretary of CONTRALESA, after their joint press briefing with the EFF yesterday. Now, coming to the issue of land and how it should be administered, and before the break, you touched on the issue of 87% of stolen land. And just looking at that particular issue, the EFF is very clear that the state should be the sole custodian of land. And I would think that this is where you and them differ slightly with regard to how it should be administered.
Well, the difference is just marginal there, in the sense that we agree that the state should be the overall custodian of the entire land of South Africa. When it comes to communal land, for obvious reasons, we have also agreed with them, actually, that traditional leaders should remain as the custodian of the communal land, even though the state will be the overall custodian. The custodianship of traditional leaders insofar as the communal land is informed by background, history and experience, as well as the issue of continuity insofar as the preservation and the promotion of our own culture as a people. You can't diminish the role of a traditional leader when it comes to ancestral land, because that's a very critical spiritual space for our people. Therefore, it has to remain under their stewardship in that context.
So you were angered by the high-level panel's report. You were angered by former President Kgalema Motlanthe saying that the land was being administered by some of the tribal chiefs as if they were tin pot dictators. And that angered you. But the EFF, through Floyd Chivambu, also raises some concerns about the administration. He spoke about the Ingonyama Trust and the fact that the land being leased to people and the tribal authority making 100 million rand or more. How is that administered? So do weigh in on that for me, please.
Well, yes, indeed, we were quite angered and taken aback by the statements by the former President Kgalema Motlanthe. We didn't expect that to come from him, and we thought that he was out of step to have said what he has said, because it's a great insult against the traditional leaders of
What exactly were you insulted by?
By referring to traditional leaders as tin pot village dictators.
But is that actually what he said? Because if he says that the traditional leaders administer the land like tin pot dictators,
that's not
he's
correct.
not necessarily saying they are. He says the manner in which you are dealing with this issue, the way in which you are administering the land is akin to how a tin pot dictator would behave.
No, President Kgalema Motlanthe was misinformed and misadvised insofar as that is concerned.
By whom?
By his advisors, Anika Klassen, Ben Cousins, who are said to be experts of land in Africa. We are experts of land in Africa. We don't need people of European origin to be experts over our land. We know how land is administered in Africa, and therefore the issue of saying that traditional leaders are acting wrongly in administrating land in the country is misinformed. There are traditional councils and traditional authorities here, more than 840 of them. They are established through the Act of Parliament, and they administer the land. It is not the individual traditional leaders who are administering the land.
But can you sit here today and vouch for each and every one of them and say that they indeed are not behaving like tin pot dictators, chasing people off the land and perhaps acting in a dictatorial fashion? Can you sit here and vouch for each and every one?
Look, the majority of them are doing an excellent job on the ground. You've got isolated cases wherein certain wrong things are happening. And we are saying that we must come up with regulations and mechanisms to ensure that wrongdoing is not allowed, and where it is happening, it needs to be corrected. And therefore, we are not saying that we are perfect, but there has been a neglect in terms of supporting the institution of traditional leadership in the country, and some of the powers, for that matter, have been taken away through the wall-to-wall municipal system. And that has partly also created a problem as to who actually calls the shots in terms of allocation of sites and so on. That is why the traditional leaders, beyond just the amendment of Section 25, we also want to have a relook at Section 12, so that we can look into the issue of the role, functions, and powers of traditional leaders holistically, because powers have been taken away from us, and some councillors are also doing very wrong things. And there's also a perception that women are not given access to land, and the young people are not given access to land, as well as other vulnerable groupings. This is not supposed to be happening. Actually, women must enjoy tenure security in our country. In terms of the African culture, tenure security is guaranteed to women because sites generally are allocated to couples who have just married, and the woman is the one who has the tenure security there.
Mr. Mkiva, unfortunately, we don't have much time left, but I just want to draw your attention to the question of the 87 and the 13%. And as you say, the 13%, that needs to be treated differently. How exactly so?
Look, the 13% is the land, the only land that is in the hands of the African majority. So more than 75% of the population is squashed in the 13%. And we're saying you can't touch that 13% because it's land that was the only one that was left in the hands of Africans. The rest of the land was dispossessed away from them by the colonial regimes as well as the apartheid government. We are saying then the people who reside in the 13% expect to benefit from the 87%. And therefore, expropriation of land without compensation should focus on the 87%, and that land should be given to the state as an overall custodian of that particular land. And that is our approach to this issue.
And just finally, we know that next year is an election year. That's fast approaching. And as I'd indicated at the start, you hitching your wagon to the EFF in yesterday's presser, you did say you are in conversation with the ANC as well, but there's talk about another summit between yourselves and the EFF. So are you concerned at all about the perception that this may be creating, that your support going into next year's election may be for the EFF and not as it was traditionally with the ANC?
Our stance as CONTRALESA is that it's time for all political parties in the country to express themselves in terms of their policy direction and policy perspective, and it must manifest in their manifestos for the 2019 election a policy on the institution of traditional leadership. We are challenging all the political parties, and that's why we are going to be meeting all of them. Next week, we will also be meeting with the PAC, and therefore, there's nothing untoward with us engaging with the EFF. And actually, they have taken the challenge, and they have assured us that in the next 6 months, they will work on that policy. On the issue of the summit, it was our resolution as CONTRALESA that we need to call a land summit and invite all the progressive formations in South Africa to be part of that land summit so that we can speak with one voice on this issue and not confuse it and conflate it with many policy directions that are confusing it. We think that is a very simple approach. The land was taken away from us. Our struggle for freedom primarily was about the restoration of our land, and it's 24 years later after democracy, the land is not yet in our hands. We think that it makes the South African state a shell, a state in paper, where land is owned by foreigners. It's not right. It needs to be corrected. This country cannot be treated like an estate agent that having oversight over land that does not belong to it. This land is our heritage. This land is our asset. Therefore, it needs to be in the firm hands of our state, as it were.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Zolani Mkiva, expressing there to us CONTRALESA's view on land expropriation without compensation, and also clarifying for us their briefing with the EFF, saying that they are working with all progressive parties in the country.